King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed,
"This is what you are commanded to do, O peoples, nations, and men of every language. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace."
Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshipped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar,
"May the king live forever. Your Majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipe, and all kinds of musics must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Pay no attention to you, Your Majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set."
Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them,
"Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?"
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king,
"O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up."
Then King Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors,
"Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?"
They replied.
Certainly, Your Majesty.
He said,
"Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods."
Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted,
"Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out! Come here!"
So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said,
"Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defiled this king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way."
Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon.
In 1 Timothy, the Apostle Paul urged his readers to pray for kings and for all those in authority, that we might live peaceful and quiet lives in godliness and holiness. What a wonderful ideal to petition God for. But we do well to remember that Jesus often cautioned his followers about being naively optimistic. And he was right to do so, because peaceful and quiet lives have not and will not always be the case for God's people. And whether on an individual or a national scale, things can deteriorate rapidly. And in fact, the question, are you prepared to die for what you believe, occurs and reoccurs with sobering frequency. In the mid-160s BC, residents of Judea faced the onslaught of Antiochus IV, the Seleucid king who was determined to stamp out Judaism. Overnight, reading Torah, circumcising your children, observing the Sabbath became capital offenses. The Jerusalem temple was repurposed as a shrine to Zeus. And among many who suffered in those days, Eleazar, an old man in his 90s, was commanded to eat pig flesh or die. Now, some of those in charge knew Eleazar, and so they urged him privately to bring his own meat, that he could swap it in the moment. At least that way he could pretend to be eating the sacrificed pig in line with the king's command. Although it would appear to onlookers that he had renounced his faith. Thomas Bilney, or Little Bilney as he was known because he was so small, was converted while reading the Greek text of 1 Timothy. And in 1531, he was arrested while preaching the gospel in the fields around Norwich. He was imprisoned, tried, and condemned to be executed, burnt at the stake. And in his cell the night before his planned execution, little Bilney received a final meal. And after he'd finished eating, he got up from the table and he held his finger in the flame of the lamp, only to recoil and shrink back from it. And his friends who were there heard him exclaim, "Can you not bear the burning of one member? How then tomorrow will you bear the burning of your entire body. Galina Vilchinskaya was a 23-year-old Sunday school teacher. Not usually a problem, but in Soviet Russia, her unwillingness to remain quiet when it came to the topic of Jesus meant prison. And yet even in prison, hunger and beatings couldn't make Galina be quiet. She led many fellow inmates to faith. And so the authorities, unable to keep her quiet, just simply transferred her to another prison. And after that, to another, till one last prospect remained for continued defiance: the Gulag and the Siberian tundra. Are you prepared to die for what you believe? Well, that's the sobering question that the narrator of Daniel 3 brings before us as he takes us back to the experience of the Judean exile. And the story begins on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And there King Nebuchadnezzar placed the golden image he had commissioned. Now, of course, being a king over a sprawling empire, the statue had to match the persona. An ornamental figure in the middle of a roundabout, the towering image 27 meters high, glistening in the early morning sun, that would display power and prestige and might, a suitable level of bling. It also displayed that the interpretation that Daniel had given the king back in chapter 2 had borne no fruit whatsoever, because instead of producing humility before the God who stands over even the greatest human empires, instead of meekness in light of the fact that God will one day bring those empires to an end, Daniel's declaration to Nebuchadnezzar, "You are the head of gold. God has given you dominion and power and might and glory," seems to have inspired other ideas. In fact, in a seeming effort to consolidate his kingdom that the dream had threatened, Nebuchadnezzar summoned the entire empire's leadership to the unveiling of his giant golden monument. Calling all verse 2 satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. And then the narrator, rather than simply saying they all came, repeats the entire list in verse 3, verbatim, in the same order, a subtle way of informing us that Nebuchadnezzar commanded exact obedience. And so the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. The scene is set. But what are they all here for? Well, a herald stands and proclaims, "This is what you are commanded to do, O peoples, nations, and men of every language." Again, note the expansive reach of Nebuchadnezzar's rule. All peoples, nations, and men of every language have assembled, not just for a fun cultural exchange and then a state-sponsored brunch and a dip in the Euphrates. No, Nebuchadnezzar has other intentions. The herald continues. "As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." Now more sinister motivations begin to emerge. This gathering will be a test of loyalty, an opportunity to publicly kiss the ring, or else. And again, signaling Nebuchadnezzar's unrivaled power in unison as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshipped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. But what about Daniel? What about the three friends? Surely they're among the satraps and governors and advisors who have gathered. Are they also lying prostrate in the dust of Dura? Or could it be in the midst of such a large crowd, all getting up and down? It's a little bit hard to clearly see what each individual person is doing. Maybe they can manage not to draw attention to themselves. Maybe they'll slip through okay. But tyrants have a track record of being intensely paranoid. Always wondering who might be plotting their downfall, always looking to spot dissent. And that tends to bring out the worst in subordinates. Like the eye of Sauron in Lord of the Rings, their gaze is always on someone, so perhaps the best you can do is make sure they're not looking at you. And so, in a classic move in verse 8, at this time some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You have issued a decree, O king, that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace." Now note the care to repeat the king's edict word for word. Everyone knows that you need to tread carefully around monarchs who wield absolute power, lest you end up in an unmarked grave somewhere in the Mesopotamian wilderness. Now, as for Daniel, well, it seems he's too risky a target. After that whole dream interpretation episode, Daniel is enjoying the king's favour, living at the king's court, at least for now. But verse 12, there are some Jews whom you have placed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, O king. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. Threefold charge. And it's difficult to know what provokes Nebuchadnezzar's ire the most. Not serving his gods, not bowing down to the image, or the fact that these three men pay him, the King of Kings, no attention whatsoever. But furious he is, and the Jewish men are summoned. Now, the narrator has been slowly zooming into this moment, reducing his field of focus step by step from the peoples and nations of verse 4 to the Jews in verse 8, to some of the Jews in verse 12, to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who are no longer just anonymous faces in the crowd, but are now exposed, their names known by the king, left with nowhere to hide. And so in verse 14, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold that I have set up? Is it true?" And maybe this is sheer incredulity. I mean, surely nobody in their right mind would defy this king's authority. Or maybe Nebuchadnezzar still had some lingering doubts about the astrologers. I mean, they hadn't exactly come through in the whole dream interpretation before. But either way, Nebuchadnezzar holds up a get-out-of-jail card. A second chance to prove loyalty. Opportunity to smooth over things. In verse 15, he says, "Now when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown into a blazing furnace." And that's not an idle threat. Jeremiah 29 remembers that Nebuchadnezzar liked to roast people in the fire. And then he concludes and he says, "Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" And here's the central moment in the whole story. The moment when internal resistance is no longer enough. Remember when Derek preached on chapter 1 a couple of weeks ago, we observed how the mighty Babylonian Empire stamped its ownership on Daniel and his friends as it put new names on them. And yet how Daniel, in that very same moment in the next verse, put it on his heart not to defile himself with the king's food, maintaining internal allegiance to Yahweh, despite all the external efforts to produce conformity and control. Daniel and his friends, a group whose inner lives refused to submit. And these are essential survival tactics for anyone who has to endure a totalitarian regime. To preserve cultural memory by recalling one's God, one's festivals and music and food. To participate in secret underground gatherings, communities which acknowledge a different set of values. And flying under the radar has worked thus far. The youths of chapter 1 are now men in their own right. But the crunch comes at the point of exposure. The moment Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego now face when the private has been made public. And the king's ultimatum is as clear as it is ominous. Defy and die. This is the moment. This is the moment where you must choose whether to stake everything on your theology. Are you prepared to die for what you believe? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter." The translation of the next verse, verse 17, is difficult, and most English versions are reticent to follow the Aramaic here. The original could mean, if our God exists, or it could mean, if our God is able to save. I think the second option is probably the better one, and I think is captured well by the NRSV, which reads, "If our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the blazing furnace and out of your hand, O king, let him deliver us." Ambivalent, I think, not so much about God's ability or power, but about whether he will decide to use it in this particular situation. And verse 18 follows that train of thought, where the three friends say, "But even if he does not rescue us, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up." What God will do is unclear. He might deliver from the fire, he might not deliver from the fire. What is clear is what God has commanded. Exodus 20, "You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make yourself an image. You shall not bow down to them or worship them." And so comes a public declaration of loyalty, not to Nebuchadnezzar, not to his gods, not to the image that he set up, but to God alone, whether that meant life or death. And so in this very same moment that the three friends are exposed, Nebuchadnezzar is also unmasked. For all his power and pomp and prestige, for all this fear-inspired loyalty he commands, for all the majesty of his empire, Nebuchadnezzar can do nothing. Nothing about three Judean upstarts who value fidelity to God more than their own lives. And in this way, the narrator just pulls back the curtain a little bit to unveil the hollow pretensions of human rule, giving us a cheeky hint perhaps that the emperor might not be wearing any clothes. And yet this turns out to be dark comedy. Mockery is quickly tempered with cold reality. Tyrants in the modern world, as much as the ancient world, so often lend themselves to being described with juvenile adjectives. I mean, you can almost laugh at their tantrums and their rants and the things that they say. But when childish tantrum has access to executive power, that is a different thing entirely. And for all his cartoon-like qualities, Nebuchadnezzar is brutal. His response is predictable and immediate. Verse 19 literally reads, "The image of his face changed," and enraged, quite possibly at the prospect that a god might come and save from his hands. Despite his prior assurance in verse 15 that such a thing was impossible, Nebuchadnezzar orders the fiery furnace to be heated 7 times hotter. He orders the strongest soldiers in his army to tie the knots, as if these measures could somehow prevent a divine rescue. And so these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. And the king's command was so urgent, and the furnace was so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. And then, against all expectations, verse 24, King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" And they replied, "Certainly, O king." And nobody else is disagreeing at this point. And he said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed. And the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Nebuchadnezzar seems to be the only one who can see this son of the gods. And who is it? Well, that's what Nebuchadnezzar wants to know, isn't it? But apocalyptic literature is so often content to pull back the curtain just enough so that you can see and know that God and his agents are active in the world without ending all the mystery. A figure appears, but note, not to rescue Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from going into the fire, but to preserve them in the midst of the fire. And so the story moves to its resolution. In verse 26, Nebuchadnezzar approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." And now the satraps, the prefects, and the royal advisors, summoned from across the empire to witness Nebuchadnezzar's majesty and splendor, gather around the 3 unharmed men who stand as a witness to God's majesty and splendor. And they saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed, and their robes were not scorched. There was no smell of fire on them. And then, with delightful irony, the narrator has Nebuchadnezzar deduce the key message of the story. He said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted him and defied the king's command, and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God." And notice how theologically nuanced Nebuchadnezzar is. God's rescue on the one hand, and the men's willingness to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God, are simply stated side by side. God did not save them because of what they had done, simply because he had chosen to. But save he did. And so the people of every nation and language, commanded to bow to the statue in verse 4, who fell down and worshipped the image in verse 7, are now in verse 29 warned not to say anything bad about the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego on pain of death, because no other God can save in this way. And then the story concludes by noting the promotion of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the last time these friends are mentioned in the book. Now, it's easy to see, isn't it, that Daniel 3 is the product of a master storyteller. Tale is entertaining, it's darkly comic, it's poignant. And like all good stories, Daniel 3 succeeds in creating a vivid portrait of an alternative world, forming a space in our imagination where we can picture tyrant-defying followers of God who would rather surrender their lives than give up on their commitment to Yahweh. And yet by retelling real-world events, the narrator collapses the distance between the plains of Dura and his readers. This is no fantasy novel being played out on an alien landscape. This is no fairy tale filled with myth and magic, but a moment in the past where 3 Judean men defied a king by refusing to worship the image he had made. And if that happened in the world that we can see and know and touch, it can happen again in our time and in our place. The narrator wants his readers to imagine themselves doing something similar. In fact, this portrayal of faithfulness to the point of death begins to question our willingness, our preparedness to follow suit. Are you willing to die for what you believe? And yet this situation in Babylon seems so extreme. A towering golden statue, the summoning of all peoples and nations and languages, a demand to worship an image, the excruciating, inevitable exposure of God's people, and the threat of imminent death. I mean, maybe this is an alien world after all, completely beyond the realm of possible experience. And so we might conclude, if only the Apostle John had not adopted this exact portrayal to help Christians prepare for similar scenarios. The Apostle says in Revelation 13 that I saw another beast coming out of the earth, and he made the earth and all its inhabitants worship the first beast. He ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast, and it could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. And in such times, John concludes, whoever has ears, let him hear. If anyone is to go into captivity they will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword they will be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people. There's a pattern of expectation for God's people. Daniel 3 gives us insight into one particular instance. And yet, as John recognized, Daniel 3 also asks every generation of God's people, are you prepared to die for what you believe? And still, there might be some who think all of this is a bit extreme. I mean, life in Babylon with Nebuchadnezzar, sure. Maybe living in persecuted regions in the world today. Okay, I can see how that works. But doesn't Jesus set the same choice before each one of us? In Luke 9, he says, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross daily, and follow me. Jesus says, will you come to the place of crucifixion with me? Are you prepared to die? And I wonder if our immediate response to that is, yes, I will. I wonder if we've really felt the weight of what Jesus is asking. Because there's a finality to death. It means an end to working and fruitful labor. It means a dislocation from the place where we belong, bidding farewell to family and friends and leaving future plans and dreams unrealized. Unless there's grief, unless there's a profound sense of loss, silent tears, sleepless nights, a sick feeling perhaps in the pit of your stomach, have you really counted the cost? And nor is this just a one-off moment that you can tick off the discipleship list. It keeps coming back. Because the world changes. People change. You change. And the decision must be made again. Little wonder that Jesus said, daily take up your cross and follow me. To serve and follow Jesus. What a glorious privilege. What an honor. But it will cost you your life. Are you prepared to die for what you believe? When old Eleazar was about to die under the blows, he groaned aloud and said, "It is clear to the Lord in his holy knowledge that, though I might have been saved from death, I'm enduring terrible sufferings in my body under this beating. But in my soul, I am glad to suffer these things, because I fear him." And in Norwich, on the morning of the 19th of August, 1531, little Bilney was led out to Lollard's pit. And after bidding farewell to his friends, he became the first reformer to be burnt on English soil. Galina Vilchinskaya was transported by train to the utter east of Siberia in a cattle car filled with the worst of the worst. And as the train rumbled on through the frozen vastness, the cursing, the fighting was broken by the sound of a young woman singing of her Saviour. Silence fell. Even hardened criminals turned away to hide their tears as Galina sang the gospel. And today, Galina continues to count the cost of following Christ, serving as a pastor's wife in Siberia, where once she was a prisoner of a kingdom that no longer exists. Let's pray together. Father, this story in Daniel 3 confronts us with a really hard question. And even though we recognize that every generation of your people has had to answer it, are we prepared to die for what we believe? Lord, you know our weakness. You know how we recoil from suffering, just like little Bilney did. Help us, Father. Help us to fix our eyes on Jesus, your faithful Son, who walked this path before us, who even now walks with us, because he too experienced what it meant to count the cost, that night in the Garden of Gethsemane. And yet out of all that turmoil of soul came a steely determination to press on and to finish all that you had given him to do. May that be true of us, Lord, in our time and in our place. Amen.